Well, hello, Riverwood. Hello to everyone joining us online, or if you're listening on podcast. You know, there's so many ways that Riverwooders stay connected over the summer, and we love it. So earlier, Pastor Todd asked me, he said, "Are you ready to preach?" And I said back, "Are you ready to be convicted?" And then he said, "We don't do that in the summer." So I said, "Fine, we'll play a game instead." So we've got a game this morning. If you're here in the room, you can just share your answer with the person beside you, meet someone new. If you're joining us online, either just guess out loud or with the people you are with. But this is the classic game of What Am I? So really simple. I'm going to give you some clues, and all you have to do is guess what I am talking about, all right? So here's the first one. What am I? I stay out as late as I want. I sleep in as late as I want. I have endless choices, and no one tells me what to do. What am I? Quick, 10 seconds, share your answer with the person beside you. All right, if you answered, I am an adult, you would be correct. Technically, this is all true. Technically, you can stay out as late as you want. You don't have parents telling you you have to be home. Technically, you can sleep in as late as you want. There might be consequences, but you can still do it. You're an adult. You have endless choices, and technically, no one tells you what to do. All right, you getting the gist of this game a little bit? Here's the next one. All right, what am I? In this place, I have friends to always hang out with, but if I'm an introvert, there's a place of solidarity if I need. It's a place where you never have to run errands. You never have to worry about making decisions, and you get to stick to a fixed daily routine. Some of you love your routines, right? Okay, what am I? Go ahead and take a guess. All right, I feel like maybe you're stumped a little bit. I'm getting that. If you guessed prison, you would be accurate. Technically, in prison, you have as many friends as you want. They might be more enemies, but they're there. You never have to leave. You never have to go get your own groceries or run errands. You never have to worry about making your own decisions. And you get that solid routine every single day, right? All right, last one. What am I? In this place, I don't have to go to work. I get my meals cooked for me and delivered. It's basically skip the dishes every day. And I can watch as much TV as I want. What am I? Take a quick guess here. All right, ready? The answer is a hospital. Technically, you don't go to work if you are in a hospital. You get all your meals cooked and delivered for you, and technically, you can watch as much TV as you want. Now, you might have heard the clues for these and thought, yes, that sounds great. That sounds amazing. But what these clues were actually pointing to was something of really great restriction, was something very less than ideal. And often what I find is that we have these ideas of what freedom is. We have these little ideas of this will make me free. You know, when we're young, it's like, if I can stay out as late as I want, then I am free. And then you become an adult and you actually have all of these responsibilities and you pay taxes and you have to get a job. And it feels less free than you thought it was. But we have these ideas of what freedom is, but often what those ideas lead to is something way more restricted. And what God shows us through Scripture is that sometimes living a life with restriction actually leads us to way more freedom. And so this month we are continuing our series that has lasted almost a year already, and it's Echoes, Catechism in a Year. And the sub-series this month is Echoes of Freedom. And we're specifically talking about the Ten Commandments. Now you might be wondering, why the Ten Commandments? Out of everything that we could be studying, why are we studying this portion of Scripture? And I think that this portion of Scripture is some of the most fascinating that we can find. We find that it's the first laws that God gave humanity to help a society flourish and be built and to make them distinct among all other nations. We find, and this is so incredible, that God verbally spoke the Ten Commandments to the Israelites. So the Israelite people, after they came out of slavery in Egypt, they gather at the base of this mountain and they see God's presence come out in smoke on this mountain, and God verbally speaks to all of them. So they all have no doubt that these commandments came from God. And they are affirmed all throughout Scripture. And as Jesus reaffirms the greatest commandments, to love your God and to love your neighbor as yourself, these are the expansion and what they actually look like in our lives. Yet most of us, somewhere deep inside, we still feel like the Ten Commandments are just thou shalt not type things. It feels like they're just these rules that we have to follow if we want to be a Christ follower, but I think they are way more than that. Imagine that you're an apprentice, and you're an apprentice for a construction company, and you show up on the job first day, and you're going to be building, let's say, decks, okay? And you show up on the job, you got your toolbox, and your boss comes and meets you and says, hey, you ready for your first day of work? And you're like, yeah, I'm so ready. I got my toolbox right here. And your boss is like, awesome. What did you bring in your toolbox? And now your job is going to be to build a deck, to be screwing down decks, and you pull out a screwdriver. Now, that's not going to get you very far, and your boss knows that. And so your boss says, you better not use that screwdriver on this job. And then your boss hands you a drill. Says, here, use this instead. This is going to get you a lot further. And now you would be foolish to put that drill down and be like, no, I really like my screwdriver, actually. I'm just going to do this. You see, we think that the Ten Commandments are just these unfair rules that we have to follow, but maybe there's actually nothing unfair about it. Maybe it's actually God just saying, hey, you're trying to live one day, and it's not going to work very well. So let me give you another tool that you can use that is actually going to get you somewhere, that is actually going to help you live the life that I have created you to live. And so we're going to be studying two tools today. And the first tool that we're going to study is from the fourth commandment, and it goes like this in Exodus 20. It says, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but on the seventh day is the Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in the 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Now, if you're wondering what this word Sabbath means, in Hebrew, Sabbath simply means to rest, or a day of rest. And depending on your upbringing, you might have a lot of emotions about this day. If you didn't grow up in the church, maybe you're indifferent, you don't really know what we're talking about, and that's okay, we're going to teach you today. Maybe you thought that this is just the day that people go to church, this is just Sunday's the Sabbath day. You might have grown up in a really strict household where you weren't allowed to do anything on the Sabbath. You couldn't work, you couldn't do chores, you couldn't shop, you couldn't go out to eat, you couldn't do your homework. You might have been a part of many debates about whether this is still a command or what day is this supposed to fall on. And I think if we were to take a poll of this whole room and a poll of everyone online, I think that the majority of us would fall somewhere between active dislike for the Sabbath and indifference. There may be a few that actively live this out and practice it, and I hope that if that is you today, that I can put fire again behind why we do this. But if you actively dislike it or are indifferent, if you have a negative idea behind the Sabbath, if you've had a bad experience from it, if you think that because of your life you are exempt from it, can I ask that you hear me out for just a few minutes as we ask God to teach us and inspire us of what did he mean when he said to remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy? Did he mean just keep going to church, or did he mean take a full day of rest? What did this actually look like? So let's get into it. In the command, it says, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. And this is the one and only time throughout the 10 Commandments where God says, remember. It's like he just knew that we were going to forget about it. So he says, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. And then he goes on to give us a reason. And I love when God does this, because I'm like, I can follow any rule if you just give me a good reason. And this is the reason. It says, for in the 6 days, the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the Sabbath day. So if we were to back up, why did God give this command of the Sabbath? The reason number one for the Sabbath is it's the order in which God created the world to flourish. So to really understand this, we have to go back to Genesis, go back to how God created the world and what that order actually looked like. And we read this in Genesis 2:2-3. It says, by the 7th day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the 7th day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. So by blessing the 7th day, which basically means that God was setting the 7th day apart from the other 6 days. The 6 days would have routine to them. The 6 days would have work to them, not just paid work, but also work of just the things you have to do to build your life. But the 7th day would be different. The 7th day would be distinct. And for centuries, we have lived in the 7th day routine. But we have found that there's a few places in history where people have tried to get out of the 7th day and change that cycle. We find that after the French Revolution, there was this desire to be different from what it was before. They were trying to create this distinct line of this is how we lived before and this is how we live after. And so after the French Revolution, they came up with a 10-day week. And people would work for 9 days, and then on the 10th day, that is when they would rest. But this caused so much fatigue. It caused so much illness, among other social and psychological strains, that it only lasted until about 1806, and then they went back to the 7-day week. They just found there's something ingrained in people for the 7-day cycle. Then again, in the late 1920s, the Soviet Union tried to change it, and they tried to change it to a 5-day week. Because they wanted to create this continuous work cycle where people would constantly be working. There was never a day off for absolutely everyone. And this also failed. There were disruptions to consistent sleep schedules. People weren't sleeping. They were getting sick. They found a huge increase in stress, in social isolation, and an increase in machine breakdown because even machines need to rest. So then they went to a 6-day week to try that. That didn't work. And so then they went back to a 7-day week. Now, you could argue that people they don't like change, that this just somehow works with our overall calendar. And yes, that might be true, but we get to trace this back to the Old Testament when God gave this command to keep the Sabbath day holy. There's something about the 7-day rhythm in our lives that is so important that we can't ignore. Reason number 2, though, beyond just that God created this rhythm for our life, he also gave us the Sabbath to enjoy God's creation and to enjoy our work. Now, we've got to understand something about this creation story right here. God didn't create the world and, he worked really hard at it and he used up all of his creative energy and then at the end he was exhausted. God was not tired after creating the world. God was not, on little sleep, he pulled a few all-nighters and then he's like, dang, I really need to catch up on some sleep here. God wasn't out of breath. He did not need to just stay in bed all day, the day after. He was not out of his creative energy. He rested, not out of being tired, but he rested out of delight for what he had created. And so he gives us this instruction too. Because the reality is we are made in the image of God. which means that we have the same characteristics. We have those desires knitted within us. And so we too can rest and take this day of Sabbath, not out of we are absolutely exhausted, but in order to delight in the things that God created and the things that in partnership we create with God. And if this doesn't convince us that God created a rhythm to our life, that God created the Sabbath so that we could simply enjoy things, he gave us another reason, and this reason is found in Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy 5, God gives us the 10 commandments all over again. And all of them are the same except for this one. He changes this up, and so he goes, observe the Sabbath day by making it holy. And then he changes the reason why we are to keep it. He says, remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. So the Israelites, right before this, they had spent over 400 years in slavery. For the people that were living at this time, they had never known a life without being enslaved, without having to fall under the direction of someone else. They had never had control over their own lives. And so by God giving this command, he's saying, hey, you're not slaves anymore. So don't live like it. Don't live like you are just a slave to work. Live like you are free. Live like you have control over your life. That work doesn't control you anymore. That desire to find satisfaction through work doesn't control you anymore. But you are free. Now, people like to debate this. We can see these reasons. We can be like, yeah, sure, those are good reasons that God gave the Sabbath back then. But what about today? Is this still a command today? Is it a sin to not follow the Sabbath today? And the common argument that people give is that Jesus freed us from the Sabbath in the New Testament. And we don't have time to look at all of the verses today, but you can find them in the notes section of the Riverwood app. But they point to the stories where Jesus and his disciples were walking and start to pick grain to snack on. And picking grain or harvesting anything was not allowed on the Sabbath during that time. We also find it where Jesus would heal people on the Sabbath. And the religious leaders, they had 39 categories of rules that people had to follow on the Sabbath. They created such a tight fence around people that really people couldn't do a whole lot on the Sabbath. And they were trying to discredit Jesus. And so they're pointing out these ways that Jesus is breaking the Sabbath rules. And Jesus replies this in Mark 2, 27 to 28. He says, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. And the other verses throughout Scripture, through the epistles, they tell us that Jesus freed us from the Old Testament law. And so people will take this and they will come to the conclusion that we are free. We don't have to follow the Sabbath because Jesus gives us true rest. And while that is true, that we find our true rest through Jesus, Jesus took away the legalism of the Sabbath, but I don't think he ever took away the reasons why we need the Sabbath. And we still live in a world where it is so needed. And so to answer the question of many of us, is the Sabbath still a command today, and is it a sin to disobey? Here's at least where I've landed. The question doesn't matter. It's a moot point. It's not the right question to ask. Because if I look and analyze my life, the times where I've asked that question, I've really just wanted to get out of it. I wanted to choose my work over rest. I've wanted to choose that frantic busyness and the satisfaction that I get from being busy over rest. I only ever asked that question because I was trying to justify my way out of it. But I've come to the place in the last couple years where I wholeheartedly believe that this is one of the greatest gifts that God has ever given us, a guilt-free day of rest. So that leads us to, what does the Sabbath free us from? And first of all, the Sabbath frees us from this curse on work. So if we go back to the creation story, and we go back to the moment where sin entered the world, and there was a curse placed onto humanity. And that word curse, it messes us up sometimes. So if that's messing you up, think of it more as consequence. There was consequences that came from sin entering into the world. And so this is the consequence that was given to man. It says this in Genesis 2:17-19. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil, you will eat food from it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow, you will eat your food until you return to the ground, since from it you are taken, for dust you are, and to dust you will return. Now, before the fall, before sin and brokenness entered into the world, work was just a joy. Work was a thing that you got to do every day to create and produce, and you would have left satisfied with what you had done. And that day of rest was simply just to fully delight in the work that you had done. But after the fall, work was cursed. And it's not this type of thing where, the ground became hard, so it really only impacts farmers. And once you get to modern technology, then you don't have to deal with this anymore. That's not what God is talking about here. What he's talking about is there is this curse on how we approach work. That for man, they would strive and toil, and work to try to produce, and work to try to provide, and never feel fully satisfied in what they've done. That they would work and still not feel like enough, so they would work and work and work and work. And what was once meant to be 100% fully life-giving now became exhausting and difficult. But the Sabbath, it frees us from that. And ultimately, Jesus and his work on the cross freed us from that. But we live in this awkward in-between, where we get this glimpse of heaven, of what Jesus has promised, but we still live in the brokenness of this world. And so by giving us the Sabbath, God is saying, hey, I'm giving you an opportunity every week, every 7-day cycle, to go back to the Garden of Eden before work was ever cursed. And if you look up Eden, the Hebrew word for Eden is delight. You get to go back to the Garden of Delight, back to that place where you simply get to enjoy God's creation and enjoy the work that you are doing together. And so Sabbath is that practical action step to convince our hearts that we don't need to find satisfaction through our work, that our identity is not in what we do, it's who we are, and we are children of God. We do not need that status, that we have freedom from work being a curse on our lives. The second thing that Sabbath frees us from is it frees us from physical exhaustion and biological consequences. So we have all probably experienced fatigue, burnout, anxiety, depression, busyness, starved relationships, worn down immune systems, low energy level, anger, emptiness. And these are all signs of life without rest and delight. And they are all states that your body cannot endure forever. It's interesting, later on in Exodus 31:14, God brings up the Sabbath again. And he says this, he says, observe the Sabbath because it is holy to you. Anyone who desecrates it is to be put to death. Those who do any work on the day must be cut off from their people. Now, this is very much an Old Testament consequence. Yet, I think there's still some truth for us today. Because the reality is that by not taking time to rest, by not sleeping well, by not taking care of our bodies are dying at a more rapid pace anyways. The lack of rest impacts our sleep, our immune system, our brain function, our reaction time, our heart rate, our appetite, our memory. Our bodies, our minds were never created to work 24/7. They were not created for that, and so God gave us a way out of it. And last of all, Sabbath frees us to love God and others. Now, the first 3 commandments that Pastor Dunstan talked about last week, they are all about loving God. The last 6 commandments that we are going to be talking about later this month are all about loving people. And this one commandment right in the middle is equally about loving God and loving others. Because how many of us, we know that it is really hard to hear God when life is busy. It is really hard to worship God and spend time with him when we are distracted and exhausted. How many of us know that when we are tired, we are very impatient and we become irritable and we're rude and we are overall less loving? If you want a specific way that you can equally love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and love your neighbor as yourself, take a weekly rhythm of rest and watch how God is going to create us way more loving in the process. Now, if I were to take a guess, my guess would be that for the last 20 minutes, most of us in this room have been playing an excuse in our mind of why we are the person who is exempt from the Sabbath. Or at least if I was here sitting here like 2 years ago, that's what I would have been doing. Our excuses go anywhere from, I'm working 3 jobs just trying to make ends meet. I'm a single parent. I'm a working parent. I'm a business owner. I'm trying to establish my career. I'm in full-time school and full-time work, just trying to get ahead. The list could go on and on and on. And the truth is that no matter what stage of life we're in, if we get in that habit of creating an excuse, we're going to have a new excuse for every stage. And I think if Jesus were to sit here and to have a conversation with you personally, at first he would just listen to your heart. And he would listen to how exhausted you are, how tired you are. He would listen to all of the challenges you're facing that you're just trying to get through. And he would listen to your dreams and the things that you are most excited about, the things that are making you so driven and you're so passionate about right now. And he would listen to all of this. But then he would ask the question, is this actually working for you? Or does something need to change? And he would take that screwdriver from you and hand you that drill, saying, here, would you just try something different? Would you just see how it goes? And so let me give some suggestions of what this actually practically looks like. Because some of us might have questions of, well, what if I'm scheduled to work on a Sunday? Can I shop on a Sunday? Can I go to a restaurant and make other people work on a Sunday? Can I do any work, any chores? Can I cook? And well, first of all, traditionally, the Sabbath is actually on Saturday. So we're doing it wrong anyways, most of us. But let's get all of that out of the way. Because the day doesn't matter. The rules, they don't matter. It's about creating a rhythm in our lives. Personally, I take this day on Monday because I work on weekends. And I have created some patterns in my life very slowly. They haven't just come all at once, but very slowly I've introduced new things. And what I've found is it's not about just having a ton of restrictions around this day, but having the right restrictions around it, having the right things that work in my life, that are life-giving, taking away the things like my phone, or I don't answer any texts or emails on that day because that is not life-giving to me, taking away the things that aren't, and fully creating around myself a rhythm of delight. So practically, how do we live this out? First, we have to prepare. We have to look ahead of time as, look, what is my weekly rhythm right now? And where does this day fall into place? For people who don't have a weekly rhythm, if you work shift work, I know that this is extra hard, so you're going to have to plan even more ahead and look at this. But what practical things do I need to do throughout the week? What chores do I need to do? What things do I have to prepare so that on this day I can fully rest? The second is worship. And this is the thing that makes this day distinct from all other days. The day of Sabbath is not just a day to stay in bed and binge watch Netflix or sleep all day. There's an intentionality behind it, and there's an intentionality to worship behind it. And naturally, if Sunday is your day off, then that makes it pretty easy because you get to come to church and you have that natural opportunity to worship. But you look for ways of, how do I acknowledge the goodness of God on this day? How do I reflect on the goodness of God this day and enjoy what he has given me? And the last thing is delight. This day isn't meant to crash from exhaustion, but it's meant to delight in the things that God has given us. It's a day meant to enjoy your favorite food. It's a day meant to spend with your family or your friends doing the things that you love best. It's the day to pick up that hobby again that you never seem to have time with, but you just love doing. It's that day to go for a walk. And it's that day to enjoy God's creation. It's that day to give undivided, undistracted attention to your spouse or your kids. It's that day to just sit and read or journal and reflect. The Sabbath, it's not meant to be a day of rules of what you can't do, but getting all of those things that are just burdens on your life out of the way just for one day to go back to Eden and simply to delight and do the things you love. Now, ultimately, I can't tell you what this day needs to look like in your life. I don't feel like that's my job to do. All I can do is point to how amazing it is to create a rhythm and why God gave us this instruction to create a rhythm for our life. And now you got to go, and you got to pause long enough to listen to God and ask God. No matter if you are a kid or a teenager or a young adult or an older adult, whether you have 5 kids or no kids, ask God, what does Sabbath need to look like in my life right now? And let him guide you through that. Okay, now we've spent the majority of our time on the Sabbath, and I'm just very passionate about Sabbath, so I had lots to teach out there. We have one more to go to teach out today. One more tool to give, and this one will be a little bit shorter, but it is the 5th commandment that God gives us. And it is this: honor your father and mother, so that you may live long in the land your God is giving you. So this word honor is Hebrew for kavod, which means to weigh heavily or to be heavy. So if you think of moving day, and you're moving a bunch of boxes, and you pick up a box of pillows, that's pretty light, right? You can toss it up, you can pass it to the person on the truck, you can just throw it around. It is physically light, and so you are going to treat it lightly. But if you were to go and you pick up something heavy, let's say china dishes, it is heavy, and so you're going to treat it differently. You're going to very slowly pick it up. You are going to gently pass it off. You are going to very slowly put it down and gently do it. It is physically heavy, and so you treat it as if it is heavy. And the same goes for honoring our parents. Honoring our parents isn't meant to treat like you're just picking up a box of pillows. It's meant to treat like we are carrying that heavy box of china dishes. And there's reason that God gave for why honoring our parents, whether we are a child or whether we are an adult, there's a reason that he gave us for honoring our parents. Just like God created an order to creation where we work 6 days and we rest for 1, he also created an order for family. So the first people, Adam and Eve, he says to them, be fruitful and multiply. And out of their oneness, coming together, they were to create a child. And that child they were to raise and teach to love God, teach how to live. And they were to raise it and help grow it and keep it alive. And then that human would one day meet someone. And it says that a man would leave his father and mother and be united with his wife. And the two would become one. And then once again, out of their oneness, they would create a child, and the cycle would continue. And so in creating the cycle, God gave this seasonal authority for parents to carry over their children in order to raise them well. And so the first reason why we are to honor our parents is that there's this natural God-appointed authority that they have over our lives for a specific time. The second reason for honoring our parents is that they were made in the image of God. So like all humans who are made in the image of God, no matter if they are perfect or if they are or seem perfect or if they are so flawed, because they are made in the image of God, they deserve at least some honor. And the last reason is because every parent who has ever walked this earth is flawed. Whether you had really, really amazing parents who you look back and you're like, they hardly did anything wrong, or if you had really awful, flawed, really terrible parents, they all have one thing in common, and that is that they all at least have one flaw. And so we honor not because of perfection, but we honor out of this awareness that everyone is flawed. Yet God still calls us to honor. And like all the other commands, there is freedom when we obey God. And the first thing that honoring your parents frees you from is conflict. Both conflict as a consequence of the result of when you dishonor, and also relational conflict. So when you're a kid living with your parents, this type of honor comes in the form of obedience. It's the acknowledgement that your parents are older, that they are the authority of the home, that they have more knowledge, that they have more wisdom. And so you submit to their authority and honor them by obeying what they have said. And this both keeps you safe, such as when a parent tells a child, don't run across the street or don't touch the stove, but it also makes you relationally healthy. Like, if you ever had those days off where it was going to be such a good day, it had it planned, it was maybe a vacation day or just a day off where you had fun activities, and maybe your parent was like, hey, before we do that, I need you to do some chores first. And out of your childness, out of your teenage hormones, you freak out. And you either refuse to do them, or maybe you just grudge your way through them. And by doing that, it kind of ruins the rest of the day. And the rest of the day was ruined. I know I had that a few times. And so this disobedience, what you thought would bring freedom from work, freedom from doing chores, actually made the rest of the day bad. Whereas honoring our parents and whereas obeying our parents would have actually given freedom to enjoy the rest of the day. Now, of course, freedom is the default when we're young, but there are exceptions. And that would be if you were in an abusive home, or a home where obeying your parents would have been a risk to your well-being or someone else's well-being, or if it went against God. In Acts 5:29, it says, we must obey God rather than human beings. Obedience is the default, but never at the expense of your well-being or God's ultimate authority. And then, of course, when we're older, this kind of honor, it looks different. You aren't any longer under your parents' roof. You're not under their authority in the same way. And so it more so comes out in talking well about your parents, holding heavy simply the role that your parents had in your life, making time for them and potentially even supporting them as they age. It starts to look different. But either way, rebellion and dishonor is costly. And it's not just those little moments of this day got ruined, but it can create this cycle of dysfunction. It can create this cycle of an unhealthy relationship. And now you could very well say that there are greater issues at play than your dishonor in those cases, and that would be true. But that leads us to our second way that honor frees us. Honoring your parents frees you from negative generational patterns. So there's this acknowledgement that your parents are flawed, whether from their upbringing, traumatic circumstances, or simply their poor choices or priorities. But the reality is, we don't get to control any of that. We can't control our parents. We can't pick the type of parents that we have. And that can be really hard to acknowledge, that the only thing that we can control is ourselves. And maybe it's hard to honor because you never saw your parents honor anyone, and they never saw their parents honor anyone, and you're part of this cycle of dishonor, of dysfunction, of hurt, and you have the choice. And I know that choice can be so hard sometimes and so heartbreaking sometimes, but you have that choice to end that cycle. You have that choice to turn things around for all the future generations that come from your family. And it's asking the question, will I show honor where honor isn't due in order to stop this cycle of anger, bitterness, and hurt for the generations to come after me? And the third thing honoring our parents frees you from then is resentment. Now, the truth is, if I were to guess, there's a lot of anger that can come from me talking about this kind of thing. There can be anger because you had a parent abandon you. There can be anger because they never said, I love you, or I'm proud of you. Maybe they were constantly choosing work over you. Maybe they were straight up awful and abusive. The list could go on and on for all the unique experiences that are represented right now. And I don't know your story, but I want to remind you that God does. Yet he still gave us this command, which tells me that maybe this command is actually more for the sake of the child than it is the parent. Potentially, this command is more than just helping families avoid conflict or setting up authority structures. maybe this command is actually meant to heal our hearts. Maybe this command is actually meant for us to depend on God wholeheartedly and trust in him, saying, God, I am broken because of what my parents have done to me. I am holding bitterness and anger because of what my parents did to me. And that I did not deserve that as a child. I did not deserve that as an adult. But I trust in you for my healing and for my forgiveness. And this, truthfully, might be the hardest thing that you ever do. But it will also help you depend on God more, to ask for wisdom, for depend on him to heal your heart for something that you feel like you can't. And that in itself is so honoring of your parents. And dishonor is only going to tighten those chains of anger and bitterness and resentment around you. I'll be honest, I don't know your story. So I can't tell you exactly how this needs to play out in your life. But ask God, ask counsel, ask for prayer, and don't carry this burden of what your parents put you through around you any longer. Let's end on a little bit of a lighter note. Honoring your parents frees you from one more thing, and it frees you to honor others. As a child, the first people you ever met were your parents. You were most likely, they were the first real relationship that you ever had. You probably learned how to be in relationship from them. And it says this in 1 Peter 2:17 about continuing this honor for our whole lives. It says, treat everyone you meet with dignity. Love your spiritual family. Revere God. Respect the government. So as we grow up, and as we are older and we begin to practice this honoring, practice this holding this relationship heavy in our lives, it's actually training our honor muscles to be able to do this for everyone. It's training us to love greater. It's training us to have more compassion for the people who are flawed and broken. It's training us to deal with difficult people with dignity. And it's going to make it a lot easier as we begin to train this muscle to be able to honor others as we continue to grow older. Now, some of you parents, you're loving this right now, and you're trying to keep your kid awake. You're like, hey, make sure you're listening to this one, right? But I want to ask a question. Who teaches a child to honor? Babies don't just come out of the womb and it's like, hey, did you know that the fifth commandment is love or honor your father and mother? Like, they don't know that. And so a child needs to be taught it, and they need to be shown it. And then sometimes when we're not taught and shown it, God teaches us and convicts us of it later. But it starts with the parents. Honor should never be weaponized. It should never be used to try to get your children to listen to you or respect you. You know, God brings up this idea of honoring your parents again in the New Testament in Ephesians 6. Where Paul brings up this commandment again and says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may go well with you, and that you may enjoy long life on earth. And then it gives an instruction to parents. It says, fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in training and instruction to the Lord. Parents, there is a reward, a promise that God gave when the children honors their parents. And we didn't even get a chance to really dig into that today, but there's this promise. And so as parents, it's your job to help set your child up for success in this. Help set them up for receiving this promise by teaching them, and greatest of all, by displaying it for them. Show them what honor looks like. And so the question I leave you with is, with what weight do you carry those relationships in your life? Do you carry the memory of your parents, the thought of your parents, like pillows that you just kind of toss around? Or do you carry it like you're carrying a box of china dishes? It's heavy. And so you carry it with this honor like it is heavy. So these are just two tools that we get to use to find freedom. Freedom from exhaustion and burnout. putting too much pressure on our performance, from family conflict, from hurt and resentment. The list goes on. But ultimately, we find true freedom through Jesus. It says this in Galatians 5:1-3. Christ has set us free to live a free life. So take your stand. Never again let anyone put a harness of slavery on you. I am empathetic about this. The moment any of you submits to circumcision or any other rule-keeping system, at that same moment, Christ's hard-won gift of freedom is squandered. If you think that these commandments, if following them perfectly is the only thing that is going to give you freedom, then that's wrong. And so I want to remind us that true freedom comes from relationship with Jesus. And we get to use these things as tools. And sometimes, that boss comes and hands us that drill and we're like, we don't know how to use it. And so that boss comes alongside us. It's like, hey, I'll show you. Stay in relationship with me and I'm going to teach you how to do this. And I'm going to actually show you through relationship what true freedom looks like. It starts with committing ourselves to that relationship with Him. It starts with depending on Him to give us the ultimate freedom from any hurt or brokenness or exhaustion that we have in our lives. It starts with simply submitting to Him of, hey God, take control of my life and lead me in where you want me to go. And one of the greatest ways that we get to do this in this moment is through worship. And so whether you are online with us or here in the room, let's engage in worship together.